Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For those in-house, we do appreciate your checking that cell phones have been turned off or silenced as we prepare to begin as a courtesy for our speaker. We, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for your future reference following today's program. Our internet viewers, of course, are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Leading our discussion and introducing our special guest is Lisa Curtis, who serves as our Senior Research Fellow for South Asia in our Asian Studies Center. She focuses on America's economic security and political relationships with Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and other nations of South Asia. Prior to joining Heritage, she was professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, handling the South Asia portfolio for the committee chairman. She has also served as a senior advisor at the State Department's South Asia Bureau, where she counseled the Assistant Secretary on India-Pakistan relations. She has served at the Central Intelligence Agency as a political analyst on South Asia, and for a period of 4 years, she was also a political officer to the U.S. embassies in Islamabad and New Delhi. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Curtis. Lisa?
Thank you, John, for that very nice introduction. And thank you all for coming today despite the weather forecast. We haven't gotten the snow or rain yet, but I appreciate your faith in that and making your way to the Heritage Foundation today. So we are here today to discuss Dr. John Owen's book, Confronting Political Islam, 6 Lessons from the West's Past. And I'm sure you noticed you can buy a copy, and I would highly recommend you do so right out front here. I think that with the political machinations that we see throughout the Middle East and North Africa over the last 4 years, really I think that we couldn't have a more timely and necessary topic for our discussion today. And I think this book will be useful for anyone that is seeking deeper insight into political Islam or Islamism and its impact on U.S. foreign policy. I think Dr. Owen's book will help advance our understanding of what I would consider the most defining ideological debate of our time, which is that of the role of political Islam in the transitions that we see happening throughout the Muslim world. So Dr. Owen takes an interesting approach to this issue. He draws on his extensive knowledge of ideological conflict in Europe. He takes us through a detailed history of the rise of Protestantism, the struggle between absolute monarchy and republicanism, and the clashes of the 20th century among those supporting either liberal, communist, or fascist ideologies. And I think this rich accounting of European history helps us to situate the current phenomenon of rising Islamism within its own historical, political, and religious context. While we are here today to talk about Dr. Owen's book, I also wanted to make brief reference to a study that I think is also available outside that was done by 4 heritage analysts recently released called Pursuing a Freedom Agenda Amidst Rising Global Islamism. In this report, we examine what's happening in 5 pivotal countries where Islamist political parties are influential. These include Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Tunisia. We found there is no one-size-fits-all strategy to cope with rising political Islam. But we also concluded that the U.S. needed to lay out some guiding principles in how it approaches these movements and ideologies. This is because Islamism is an ideology that is unlikely to either burn out or fade away anytime soon. And even though we need to examine it within its own cultural and historical context, I think it's also safe to say that U.S. policy will almost certainly help shape the future of political Islam in crucial ways. And that is, of course, why we're here today. So in our heritage study, let me just point out some of the guiding principles that we identified in how the U.S. should approach Islamism. First, the U.S. should prioritize support to civil society to allow the civil society to strengthen its political voices. Second, when encouraging democratic development in a country, it is crucial to focus on comprehensive and consensus-based constitutional development. And this is, of course, what we saw in Tunisia, a successful process in Tunisia over the last couple of years. It's also necessary to require political parties to oppose violence unequivocally as a prerequisite for participating in the political process. And this is necessary to avoid the often blurred lines between Islamist political parties and terrorism. It's important to prioritize free market economic reform as well as improve rights and economic opportunity for women. And lastly, the U.S. needs to speak out loudly and consistently in defending religious minorities within the context of rising Islamist movements. So let me say a bit about our speaker today. Dr. Owen is the Taylor Professor of Politics and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. He is also author of The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, Transnational Networks, States, and Regime Change, 1510 to 2010, and of Liberal Peace, Liberal War, American Politics and International Security, which was published in 1997. He is also co-editor of Religion, the Enlightenment, and the New Global Order, and he has been published in various publications, too many to name here, but some Foreign Affairs, National Interest, New York Times, among many others. Currently, Dr. Owen is working on two research projects. One, Soft Power, America and the Future of the International Order, and the second, Fifth Columns in Peace and War. He holds a BA from Duke University, an MPA from Princeton University, and a PhD from Harvard University. So we are just delighted to welcome here today Dr. Owen. I'm going to turn the floor over. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that introduction and the précis of the Heritage Report, which I look forward to reading. Thank you all for coming out on a day that I had no idea snow was even forecast for. I was buried in some work this morning and didn't even check the weather forecast. And so thanks for coming out. It's very nice to be back at the Heritage Foundation. As Lisa Curtis remembers, I was here a bit over 2 years ago leading a workshop on two of this book's chapters as they were in formation. And Lisa and Jim Phillips, Cully Stimson, and others were extremely helpful to me. And that I plan to continue that help today, because if any of you has complaints about the book, I'll just say, well, that was Lisa's idea or Cully's idea. I'm, of course, an academic and a general scholar of international security at that. I am not an expert in counterterrorism. I'm not even a scholar of the Middle East per se. So I doubtless have less specific knowledge than many of you in the room on particular questions. And when we get into the discussion time, I look forward to hearing what you have to say. But this is a big picture book. It's a look from at least 10,000 feet, maybe more. And sometimes I will swoop down and look a little closer to the ground. But it is a big, takes the long view. I'm going to make just a few points today. First, very quickly, just to amplify a little bit what the book is about and what it's not about. It is not just about the war on radical terrorism, radical Islam, jihadism. It does cover these things. It is about political Islam more generally, Islamism, the ideology that underpins, but is not limited to, jihadist terrorism. It also underpins many regimes and movements in the Muslim world, many of whom eschew terrorism, many of whom are not necessarily that radical, and I have in mind especially the government, the regime of Saudi Arabia, which I regard with most scholars as Islamist of a different sort, but it has, of course, for years been a kind of security partner with the United States in the region. The book also deals with secular actors, secularists in the Muslim world as well. And so the book has, again, more than just sections about jihadism and terrorism. It tries to be broader, but to see those things as part of a larger movement. How does this book differ from other books on this topic? Because there are many, and many more will be coming out. The most important difference is seen in the subtitle, I think, which is 6 Lessons from the West's Past, and Lisa's already alluded to this. I do approach Islamism from a different angle from most others. Instead of probing it in isolation, as most do, and I think they're right to do that, that's indispensable, I begin by saying that Islamism is a prolonged case of something, and that something we have seen before in the West's own history, and I call that transnational ideological conflict. Struggles over the best way to order society, struggles that stretch across entire regions and even beyond regions, and that last for many decades. These struggles trigger state and non-state violence, and they skew politics within and among countries in all kinds of ways. Scholars and journalists often gesture at this and make analogies, draw analogies between what's going on now with Islamism and what has happened in the European past. So you sometimes hear the Arab Spring is like the European revolutions of 1848. The Middle East is entering a 30 years war. Confronting Political Islam, this book is, as far as I know, the only book-length sustained treatment of these analogies. And if I could sum up the basic message of the book, it comes from Mark Twain. Mark Twain supposedly said this. I'm not sure he did. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So these are not, when I draw analogies, they are not meant to be precise, but I think we can mine the past for some insight about what's going on now. So let me make the story clear with a story from 450 years ago in Europe. This is a story of 3 rebellions in Scotland, France, and the Netherlands. All over northwest Europe in the 1560s, all 3 of these countries were monarchies, all had rebellions that were led primarily by nobles. These were the people with weapons. The main leaders in each of these were Calvinists, adherents to that branch of Protestantism founded by the Reformation theologian John Calvin, who was still alive. Calvin was living in Geneva. Calvinism was a transnational movement. It was a highly cohesive network of clergy and nobles, very anti-Catholic at this point in its history, and Catholicism was very anti-Calvinist at this point. Geneva could be compared to the nerve center of transnational Calvinism. Calvin's followers communicated not just with Geneva, but with each other across states. Way before the internet or even the telegraph, they were able to do this. More broadly, as most of you will remember, across most of North and Western Europe at this point, there was a deep divide over religion. But I call this an ideological struggle because religion and politics were intimately mingled at this point in European history. This is before what we call the separation of church and state. So the religious questions were political questions. What shall be the established religion in a given polity? And which religion shall we exclude? Which branches of Christianity shall we exclude? So that's the backdrop. The first rebellion was in Scotland, which was then a separate kingdom from England, ruled by a queen regent from France, a Catholic, who was facing a growing Calvinist movement among the Scots nobility. In 1558, in neighboring England to the south, Queen Mary Tudor, Mary I, died. She was a militantly Catholic ruler. Her half-sister, Elizabeth Tudor, became queen. She was a Protestant. And in 1559, Elizabeth reestablished Protestantism as the religion in England, a particular type we call Anglicanism. This move of Elizabeth's energized the Scots Calvinists north of the border. They began to rebel against the Queen Regent. They made contact with Elizabeth's agents, said, we would like to do the same thing that you've done in England here, and we would like to talk with you about some sort of Anglo-Scots union. These Scots Calvinists were Presbyterians. They had some early successes in their rebellion, and then things stalemated between them and the Queen Regent and her troops in Scotland. France sent thousands of troops to intervene. This is a foreign intervention to help the Queen Regent. Elizabeth in England and her advisor said, we need to counter-intervene. They sent thousands of troops north of the border, and lo and behold, the English troops and the Presbyterians won. There was a revolution in Scotland, and Scotland became a reformed realm, they called it, and became an ally of England in 1561. So that's Scotland. Quickly, in France, the situation was similar, also ruled by a Queen Regent. She had also a rising Calvinist movement called the Huguenots. She had been negotiating with them and had granted them some limited toleration in January 1562. In March of that year, one of the great families of France, the Guises, who were militantly Roman Catholic, massacred a group of Huguenot worshippers. This triggered the first of the so-called French Wars of Religion. The Huguenots called out the troops, as it were, and said, right, if that's how you want it, we'll have a war. These went on for more than 30 years. Here again, England sent troops to intervene to help the Huguenots, only this intervention went bad. It did not work. Finally, quickly, the Netherlands, Low Countries. This is what is now both the Netherlands and Belgium, ruled by Spain at the time, a Catholic ruler, had a growing Calvinist movement. King Philip II of Spain was greatly worried about the Calvinists in the Netherlands. Why? Because he observed what had happened in France and in Scotland and saw the same thing happening in the Netherlands. So he set up an inquisition in the Netherlands. This backfired, and lo and behold, a Calvinist rebellion broke out in 1566. And the English and the French Huguenots sent troops to help their Calvinist brethren. So lots of unrest, rebellion, foreign intervention in Northwest Europe during these years. This, I submit, is not precisely, but a lot like the Middle East, parts of the Middle East have been over the last many decades. A legitimacy crisis, a long struggle that stretches across a number of states at once over ideology, over the right way to order society, transnational networks that communicate with each other, periodic rebellions and revolutions, foreign interventions. This has been going on, off and on, in the Middle East for a number of decades. The basic struggle in the Middle East now, as I argue with lots of other people, agree with other people on this, began in the early 20th century with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, was an avowed secularist. He said, if Turkey, first of all, there's no more caliphate or Ottoman Empire. I'm a Turk. If Turkey is going to be a real country, it has to modernize, has to become like the Europeans, including European secularism. Ataturk had imitators in the region, Reza Shah in Iran, later Jinnah in Pakistan, Nasser in Egypt. Nasser spawned lots of imitation in the Arab world. This was 20th century secularism, and it explicitly rejected traditional Islamic institutions, including Sharia, or Islamic law. There was pushback from very early on. In Egypt, Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. Similar things going on a few years later in Iran, and thus arose modern Islamism, which is an ideology that says society ought to be, or the laws in society must come from sacred sources, from the Quran and the Hadith, or the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And thus emerged in the 20th century a great struggle between Islamists and secularists. It has changed significantly in the ensuing decades. There are very few pure Ataturk-like secularists left in the Middle East, at least they won't say so. And Islamism has sprouted into a number of different sub-movements, some of which are at war with one another, as you well know. In the book, I confine my attention to the Middle East and North Africa just to make the problem manageable. There are many interesting things to say about Southeast Asia, some encouraging things to say, but I don't really touch on those in the book. I'm focusing on the Middle East. The book draws 6 lessons, and I will not give you all 6 because I don't have adequate time, and I want to focus attention on just 2 of those. The 2 are, one Lisa really highlighted a minute ago. First one is, we learn from history that we should not sell Islamism short. Don't sell Islamism short. One thing that surprised me as I began to research this book was how many people, smart people, people I've learned a lot from in reading about Islamism, academics, think tank people, journalists, keep prophesying a quick demise for Islamism, particularly of radical jihadism, but also the underlying ideology. I've concluded that we in the secular liberal West have trouble believing that an ideology that seems so backward can last. Surely an attempt to retrieve religious law from the Middle Ages is going to fail. Surely this type of ideology and the institutions it calls for can't make it in the 21st century. The thing is, Islamism has always been underestimated by its opponents. I think that's one of its secrets. What has happened, what you see time and time again, is secularists, opponents of Islamism of various sorts, don't take it seriously enough. They underinvest in opposing it, and lo and behold, it succeeds and goes on from strength to strength. There's an analogy from history that I want to explicate just briefly. This is not from the 16th century Catholic Protestant struggles that I mentioned a moment ago. This is from another of my great historical cases, the long struggle that began in the 1770s, really partly with the American War of Independence, between monarchism and republicanism. And this was mostly European, but it also stretched into the Americas. Monarchists, of course, believed that government should be headed by a ruler who inherited his throne. Republicans believe that government should be elected and accountable. So by Republican, I just mean small r Republicans. Ironically, monarchists thought that republics always degenerate into chaos, civil war, and then dictatorship. So they didn't take republicanism seriously in the long term. They certainly took it seriously in the short term. But they looked at the lessons of ancient Rome. The Roman Republic became a Caesarist regime. This is what always happens to republics. The story of Republican France vindicated this view. What happened? Well, in 1799, Napoleon became first consul, and a few years later he crowned himself emperor. France went from a republic to a dictatorship. So the monarchist view is this is of course this would happen. That republics can't make it in the world. They have to become dictatorships or they die off. So after Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, monarchists were pretty confident that liberal movements that had propelled the French Revolution were done. The problem is they weren't. Liberal networks continued to crisscross Europe. And by the way, most people in the room probably like these networks are sort of our people, constitutionalists, Republicans, and so on. But they were not the people of the monarchists. The monarchists really were alarmed by them. And these networks kept communicating with each other, plotting. Every once in a while, they would break out in a revolt, and then others would follow. One round of these revolts took place in the early 1820s, a second in the early 1830s, and the biggest of all was in 1848. The rulers of Europe, the monarchists, were aware of this problem and aware of the networks, and Metternich in Austria had a kind of a secret police to monitor these networks. They operated in the Masonic lodges and so on. But he and others really did believe that this was a sort of a rearguard action, a lot of extremists, dangerous in the short term, but their system can't work and so on. Ironically, we know now liberalism, republicanism, small l, small r, eventually won out in Europe. That's not to say that Islamism is going to win in the Middle East now. The point, rather, is that an ideology that seems to outsiders impractical and unworkable sometimes can last quite a long time. So it won't do to underinvest in opposing it if you do oppose it. And this is especially true if the ideology has state sponsors. State sponsors, I call those exemplar states in the book, provide both moral support and a moral example of an ideology at work. So here think of Iran for some Islamists. And they also can provide material support, money, weapons, training, and so on. So once an ideology establishes itself in a major state, the ideology can go on much longer than its opponents think. So that's lesson 1. And let me go to lesson 2. Lesson 2 is ideologies are usually not monolithic. Usually not monolithic. The history of these ideological movements in the Western world shows us that opponents of an ideology always argue about this question: is this ideology a monolith? A monolith literally is a monument cut out of a single piece of stone. A polylith is a monument cut out of 2 or 3 or 4 pieces of stone. So that's how the metaphor works. They argue, is this a polylith or a monolith? Some say now that Islamism is essentially a monolith, a single movement, and we need to treat it as such. Practically speaking, we shouldn't play divide and conquer. We should not cooperate with any Islamists because they're all basically working for the same thing, and it will not go well for us. Others say, no, of course we should play divide and conquer. Some go so far as to say there's no such thing as Islamism. They're just Islamisms, and it won't do to make it into a unified single movement. Here, let me introduce yet another of my big historical cases of ideological conflict, but this one's going to be quite familiar. It's a 20th century struggle among fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. Fascism, of course, drops out at the end of World War II, leaving the contenders liberal democracy and communism. And I want to focus especially on the way American policymakers in the Truman administration grappled with the left in Western Europe after the Second World War. The left comprising communists and various types of socialists. Some Americans at the time saw the European left as a monolith and did not want to work with any of them. They're all hostile to free markets. They're all socialists are just communist in less of a hurry and that sort of thing. Others said, no, some of these people we can work with. They want to work with us. I think Harry Truman and his administration got this right. They said it depends. And they said we can influence just how monolithic or polyolithic the left is in Europe. They believed that some European socialists really were anti-communist and could be worked with. Quick case studies of 3 countries, Italy first. In Italy, the socialists and the communists in the late 1940s were more or less indistinguishable. They were all pro-Stalin. They were all hostile toward an alliance with the United States and toward the Marshall Plan. The Truman administration studied this closely and concluded that we couldn't work with any of them. Instead, the administration cultivated a very small liberal party in Italy, but mostly the Christian Democrats, which is a large Catholic-based party. And the relationship between Italy and the United States went quite well from 1948 elections on into the 50s and 60s. France was a different story. In France, there was a strong communist party with bases in the trade unions, but the Socialist Party in France was anti-communist. Léon Blum, who had been a leader in the 30s, was still around. The Americans cultivated him, brought him to America. The left in France was polylithic, and the Truman administration recognizes. It didn't say just because they're united monolithic in Italy doesn't mean they're monolithic in France. It also helped the United States see its way to cooperate with the French socialists that the French right, de Gaulle and others, really didn't like the United States much and it wasn't clear they were going to cooperate with the Americans. So the United States built a productive relationship in the late 40s and 50s with the French socialists. And finally, Germany. Here, the socialists or social democrats of Kurt Schumacher were anti-communist and anti-American. And so the Americans decided we can't really work with them at all. So the Americans worked with Adenauer and the Christian Democrats. So the point is, the Truman administration calibrated, it monitored the situation in each country and said, what is the left like? What's the lie of the land? Maybe we can work with these people, maybe we can't. It didn't romanticize the left, nor did it demonize. It just said, practically, what can we do? So Islamism today. Well, this is the case as well that the Saudi regime is extremely Islamist, but it has cooperated with the United States for many decades. The United States has also cooperated quietly and very temporarily with Iran against the Taliban some years ago. Now, I'm not privy to this, but I can't help but think the U.S. is tacitly cooperating with Iran in combating the Islamic State and the Assad regime too, at least by not attacking each other right now. That's a form of cooperation. At the same time, the United States can't fall into believing that the U.S. can be friends with an Islamist regime like Iran the way it is with Britain or Canada. that's also a lesson of history. So I have lots of other lessons about how ideological struggles end. Western history has a lot to say about that, and how we might get clues about how it's going to come out. But I need to stop and take your questions. History has a great deal to teach us, and I hope you will find it as beneficial as I have to mine Western history for lessons about Islamism. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think that was a very enlightening conversation. Really made me think quite a bit, relating it back to the challenges that we are facing today in the Muslim world. And I hope you all got a lot out of it too. And now we're going to turn to Q&A. And I would just ask that you would state your name, your organization, and please try to keep it to a question. So I'm going to turn the floor over if anybody wants to be bold enough. You know, actually, I'm going to take the opportunity of being the host and ask the first question. Sure. That's all right. Okay, so I was intrigued. You didn't talk about this much, but in your book, I noticed that you talked about the legal issues and how most Muslim countries have a mix of Sharia or Islamic-based law and civil-based law, and that it's different in different countries. So my first question is, do you have any examples that you can relate back to that in your knowledge of ideological conflict in Europe, where there was some debate and how that might have been resolved? And then my second question is, any examples where the elements of an ideology or a movement where the peaceful elements won out over the more violent ones? And I alluded to this in my introductory remarks, that this seems to be the defining characteristic, is the support for violence. That seems very basic, but when you're looking at, we talk about the threat of political Islam. Well, I think the threat manifests itself when you have blurred lines between Islamist political parties and terrorist groups. For instance, when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt, they released several hundred known terrorist leaders. So clearly that is not in the U.S. interest. So it's the kind of blurred lines between the political parties and the violent groups that I think is so problematic for the U.S. So do you have any examples of that in your history?
Good. Very good questions. They both have to do with blurring lines, really, and that's something I didn't talk about a minute ago. But first of all, I talk in the book about what different ways that an ideological struggle can end. And one of those is what I call convergence, where two contending ideologies at least partly merge. Elements of one and elements of the other combine into a new hybrid ideology that at one time would have seemed impossible and incoherent. One example of this actually comes in most historians say, the 1860s in Europe. This is monarchism and republicanism finally coming to terms. Because now, think about today, European countries, some of them are monarchies, some of them republics. You probably couldn't name which is which, but there are a lot of monarchies left in Europe, not just Britain. So they don't fight over this anymore. They don't even notice. How did that happen? Well, the revolutions of 1848, the usual story historians tell, those revolutions really traumatized the royal houses of Europe and the monarchists. They realized, although in 1849 they pushed back, invaded, the Russians and Austrians and Prussians invaded lots of little republics and overturned their republican governments. And it looked like republicanism was done. What happened in the ensuing 2 decades is a new deal was struck between republicans and monarchists that ushered in what historians often call liberal conservative, if you can picture that, liberal conservative or reforming conservative regime. This is true in Piedmont, which becomes Italy, modern Italy, in France, in Prussia, in Austria, in other states. Not Russia. Russia's the big outlier, retained its absolute monarchy. But these were states that became more constitutional. They had elected parliaments starting in the 1860s, 1870s. And they looked to Great Britain as a kind of a model. Britain was a constitutional monarchy. The other states of Europe were greatly impressed that the one great power that had emerged from the 1848 revolutions nearly unscathed was Great Britain. And they decided, and the British love to talk about this, why is our Constitution so superior? Because it's balanced, it's constitutional. We're not an absolute monarchy. We have a parliament, we have the rule of law, and so on. Those are arguments that decades before the absolute monarch has dismissed, and now they began to take them seriously. So Britain pointed the way toward a sort of a moderate hybrid regime. In today's world with Islamism and secularism, different countries have tried different hybrid regimes. I don't want to talk now about Southeast Asia. I want to continue focusing on the Middle East. One of these, it looked, notwithstanding the troubles with the Muslim Brotherhood and its policies, it looked early on like Egypt after the Arab Spring might become this sort of regime where the Muslim Brotherhood won elections that looked free and fair, and at least for a few weeks or months wasn't taking steps to that were overly hostile toward non-Brotherhood people. That, of course, ended badly, spiraled downward. Tunisia, probably a fragile situation there, but Tunisia, which is not large enough or central enough to be what I call an exemplary state, but Tunisia so far seems to be weathering this pretty well. The Ennahda withdrew itself from a recent election and have agreed to abide by the new president so far, who was tied to the old regime. What's necessary here is that Islamists and their enemies agree to a certain set of rules, and when they lose an election, they agree to withdraw from power and just contest the next election. Big question about whether, so that's a sort of a hybrid regime analogous to what happened in the late 19th century in Europe. It remains to be seen whether this is just a story of Tunisia or if it's more applicable to the Middle East in general. But I am one of those people who place a fair bit of hope in the Tunisian example. Turkey also looked like it was an Islamic democracy. 2 years ago, I would have said, I think I did say it was. Erdogan has been doing some things lately, as I'm sure you know, moving away from democracy, and it's quite depressing, actually, what's been happening to the Turkey as exemplar. Other question, are there examples of an ideology where the peaceful elements won out? Let me go back to the European left in the 20th century, and the answer is yes. If you know the story of the Socialist International, the first international founded by Marx and Engels way back in the 1860s included anarchists and socialists. That fell apart because those two disagreed sharply over the state. So the second international was just the socialists. Anarchists were excluded. Anarchists went on to become terrorists, and you know some of that history, I'm sure. And then the second international split during World War I between the hardcore, what we came to call communists, Lenin and some others, and the socialists, and the difference was the communists said we need we call for a general strike and we need to be willing to use violence and revolution. The socialists are more reformist. So that was the birth of European social democracy, and it came out of the same roots as communism, and indeed, if you go back far enough, anarchism. This is an ideology that split into a number of wings, and while I'm not a social democrat myself, one has to respect the liberal democratic credentials of social democracy in Europe and Latin America. They really have been able to play by the rules. So that's an example that we can draw on and learn from, but it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's automatic. I think some Islamist movements have to prove themselves. I'm encouraged again by Ennahda in Tunisia. It seems to be following this script, but lots of other groups are not. So, yeah.
Okay, right here, this gentleman. Oh, there's a microphone if you want to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What concrete evidence is there that the scenario you're outlining in Europe is any applicability, Tunisia's side, which you said is too small a country,
Yeah.
that this is ever going to play out in a way that is favorable to the West, that won't become that it won't become, no matter who triumphs among all these factions, a mortal threat to Western civilization, because Iran's going to get a nuclear weapon. It doesn't look like this administration is going to do a damn thing to stop them. And then that begins to spread all over the Middle East, because everybody else is going to want one to protect themselves from
Right.
Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can understand the nuclear issue. It certainly is tied up in the ideology. It also has some other elements to it, and it is quite alarming. Yeah, I can't prove anything using this history. All I can say is the Tunisian example, were it generally applied, might help. I am not encouraged. Let me just say I'm pessimistic about this, partly because of what happened in Egypt, because of what Morsi and the government did from fairly early on. It was pretty clear, and I know Egyptians who were seeing this quite early on, what was going to happen, partly because of what's been happening in Turkey, which looked like a much more hopeful case. And maybe the tide can turn in Turkey, I don't know. But 2014-15 were not encouraging on that score. So yeah, I don't mean to sound like an optimist. I wish I could be. I think I fall on the pessimistic side, but I do think historically there are ways out of these sorts of problems, and that's what I use history to get at. But I don't think the region now is on that kind of track. So.
Thank you.
Do you want a microphone?
Sure.
Yeah, because we're being webcast. So
Sure. Chris Landaniu. The current administration took a number of steps once it came in power. Among them, the apology tour, support or accommodation to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt,
Right.
Looking the other way at the freedom movement in Iran, not keeping much of a force in Iraq. My question is, how much do you think these actions emboldened the Islamist movement, or put another way, even if we had what you would expect to be the antithesis of those sorts of actions, would we have the same situation? And even more importantly, looking forward, how important do you think it is that we have a president elected in 2016 that takes a different view in order to stop the spread of Islamism?
Yeah, I think the United States clearly has some effect. We are the superpower, long history in the Middle East. I'm one of those people who thinks that mistakes were made after 9/11. The mistake is not being involved in the region. It's, I think, uses of force and ways of carrying out a war and a post-war settlement that were not sufficiently cognizant of conditions on the ground. And we can talk about that if you want, but that's my general take. So I think this administration has swung too far in the opposite direction, thinking that if we can do anything, insofar as we can do anything, it's just about conciliating Islamists, and a lot of what's gone wrong is our fault, and so we need to signal them that this is a different regime, and so on. And that did not work. In the case of Iran, it's especially instructive there. In the last chapter, I have a short concluding chapter of the book where I title it "What to Do and What Not to Do," because there's some things you can do, either using force or just trying to be diplomatic and use conciliation that don't work and can do more harm. I think one thing we need to acknowledge is that the United States actually can't solve this. This is something for Muslims to solve. We can help at the margin. We can offer support, and I agree with what I gather is the Heritage conclusion of supporting civil society. I'm a Tocquevillian regarding this country. I think civil society is vital to understanding American democracy, but also more broadly how a well-functioning 21st century democracy operates. So civil society, a layer of institutions between the state and the individual, is vital. Islamic countries have a lot of this. They have, and a lot of it's based in the mosques. These are the facts on the ground. I think the United States can and ought to work with people in civil society in these countries who have constructive agendas, who are as hostile toward the radicals as we are. And that's key, getting back to something Lisa said. You know, the problem is when someone like Morsi releases terrorists saying, well, we're not terrorists, but we think these guys deserve, they've gotten a bad deal, or we have to understand where they're coming from. That's obviously a huge mistake. So learning from the Cold War again, the United States, a quick story about the Philippines. When the Reagan administration agreed to dump Ferdinand Marcos and to support Corazon Aquino, Aquino had to do certain things, concrete things, say certain things before the administration would go along with that. And among those were disavowing having communists in the government, agreeing to let the U.S. naval and Air Force bases stay. Corazon Aquino, her husband had a history, is not exactly a pro-American. But at that point, early 1986, a deal was struck. And that deal, Philippines has been through a lot of changes since then, but the deal is basically stuck. And that's the sort of thing that the United States can do. But it's slow. It requires economic tools, sometimes a threat of force, lots of monitoring and cultivating of people. So I think it is possible for the United States to help. But again, to think that we can radically alter conditions on the ground with our great power, I think that just hasn't come true, and we can't fall victim to that again. So I would hope the next candidate for president is, I would say, falls in between the last two administrations. But I think mistakes have been made by both, and we might be in a position to get this right now. So.
I think this gentleman back here.
Jack Rosenko, the Endowment for Community Leadership. You talked about Europe and the monarchists and the republicans.
Yep.
Did you compare that and the effect of monarchies in the Middle East today, particularly Morocco and Jordan? I couldn't have imagined that 10 years ago an Islamist-based prime minister would be in Morocco with the monarch still there. So have you looked at that effect that the modern monarchs have today in the region?
I haven't, but one thing that intrigues me is how the states that weathered the Arab Spring best were the monarchies. Jordan and the Gulf monarchies, Morocco, right? The republics actually fell, or some of them did. Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, others. Syria is still going through its civil war, and so on. This is the reverse of what I think Americans would expect, because we associate monarchy with the past and republicanism with the present. These are different sorts of republics. These were not democratic republics, of course, but they were but they were not monarchies. So I don't quite know what to make of that, except to say that in those countries, monarchy has evidently a lot of legitimacy. That doesn't mean the Saudis can do whatever they want and they'll stay in power. They're very aware of the threats to their throne. But after World War II in Europe, the Truman administration did not want monarchy. Say in Italy, it thought that Italy should not have a king. Churchill and the British disagreed. Churchill actually thought Italy is a monarchy by nature and it needs to have a constitution. And we had the power, so we won that debate. Perhaps we could take a leaf from Churchill's book when it comes to the Middle East and say, at least in the Gulf region, in particular in Jordan, I think, monarchy is legitimate. We need to work. We are working with them, but we need to just continue doing that and recognize that this is a different part of the world with different ways. But monarchy need not mean absolute monarchy, oppressive. It can develop into a constitutional type monarchy. And I think some of the states like Kuwait have been moving in that direction. Yeah.
My name is Salim. I'm from the Voice of America. My question is regarding Islamism in Bangladesh.
Uh-huh.
Lisa pointed out before you start your speech. Bangladesh is now facing an extreme political instability, and people believe that Islamist forces, especially the Al-Qaeda, recently announced that they are opening a base in India. Al-Qaeda and ISIS members are being recruited in Bangladesh. These are believed by many people. What do you think about the future of Bangladesh? How Islamist forces can influence the politics and overall situation of Bangladesh?
I will have to plead mostly ignorance on the case of Bangladesh. I'm not an expert on that country or indeed on South Asia. I will say that the only thing I can say at this point is that it's quite alarming what's been happening because of the tendency for Islamists to outlast prophecies of their own doom, which I mentioned a minute ago. One worry I would have is that the Bangladeshi government and elites in that country would not take Islamism as seriously as they ought to, and as I said a minute ago, underinvest in opposing it. I think this has been, my take on Pakistan has been that has been part of the problem, that secularists, some of whom I've met and talked to, I think now are taking this seriously, but dismissed it or thought they could use it to poke India in the eye over Kashmir. They can use Islamism, and now they realize it's gone beyond that with the school shootings last fall. So my hope is that Bangladesh, anti-Islamists in Bangladesh will be paying close attention to the rest of South Asia and what's going on and take this extremely seriously.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami, but I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is, do you see any parallel in Europe when these kind of fundamentalist movement were supported by certain regime? For example, in Pakistan, it was Jannah Zia who brought this Jenny out of bottle, and it was with the blessing of America, Reagan administration, and Saudi Arabia.
Right.
And now they are out of control, and we
Right.
are blaming Pakistan only. So do you have this kind of parallel in European movement, like in 16th or 17th century, when you had these problems there? Thanks.
Yeah, I never thought of that question. That's right. In the Cold War context, Zia with America's blessing, yeah, exactly. Let's see. The first thing that comes to mind is efforts by monarchs in late 18th century Europe to introduce some elements of the Enlightenment into their courts and into their countries. We forget in the United States the early regime that the Enlightenment seemed to point to, as Voltaire said, was absolute monarchy. Why? Because the monarch can surround himself with scientists and modern thinking people and exclude the church from his court, and he can impose rationality on society by building public works, by balancing the budget, by building a bureaucracy, and so on. This was not democratic. This is actually a top-down sort of reform. So the Enlightenment ends up undermining and dissolving these absolute monarchies in the end. But they thought they could actually use it to buttress their power. They could make use of it because their big enemy, the monarchs in the 18th century, was the nobility and the church, Catholic Church. Those were the big challenges to its power. The monarchs thought if we could just better society and bypass and undercut the pesky aristocracy and these bishops, then we'll have more power and be able to do what we want more. It worked for a few decades. It ended up as a very bad bet. They ended up, some of them with their heads lopped off. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. It can be quite a bad bet. Now, in the 1970s, it looked like, this is a long time ago, who knew that the Soviet Union was going to collapse? It looked like a smart thing to do in this city, in Islamabad, in Saudi Arabia as well. But in hindsight, it looks like it was a very bad bet. Yeah.
Did you start the question? Yeah, okay, right there in the back.
Hi, Patrick Kelly. I just wanted to ask, what's your opinion with the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and its claimant as, restarting the caliphate and al-Baghdadi claiming to be the caliph? Do you think that's going to serve as a unifying force among the various Islamist organizations, or a divisionary force, as you've kind of seen with some groups pledging support and others breaking apart? And how do you think that will impact the historic trend of Islamism? Thank you.
I don't want to make a prediction. I can say that's a very good question. I'm sure it occupies a lot of people in this city, maybe in this room. So far, it seems that it's competing with al-Qaeda. In fact, I would say that there's this phenomenon, outbidding, terrorist outbidding, some of the things in Europe lately and in other places might partly be due to this, that the Islamic State is showing itself. I mean, it is formidable, no question. It controls territory. income stream. It is a new kind of creature. It's got to be worrying Al-Qaeda. So Al-Qaeda needs to show that it's still the most powerful, most able to damage the West, most able to, accomplish the agenda. So I think this outbidding, I'll see you, you're a terrorist act, and I'll raise you one. I think that's what's going on so far. Whether there can be some kind of, so that it's bad for us either way, right? This outbidding is horrible. It would also be bad if they united. What has to happen is their defeat. It might be that their divisions somehow can be used by other parties. Maybe we can be a party of that to defeat them. It might be there's nothing we can do about it. My title of my chapter is Ideologies Are Usually Not Monolithic. There's some events and conditions under which they can act like a monolith, at least temporarily. And we certainly want to avoid that as well. So, but very good question.
I'm going to take one more just to make sure. Okay, this gentleman here. Wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
To what extent do you think that outcomes are flavored by the culture in these different regions, so that the culture in Europe is different that from the Middle East or Asia and things like that, where people have got certain institutions and learnings and books they rely on and things like that, which would lead us to think that certain outcomes are more likely over other ones that we have seen in Europe?
Right. I think culture matters a lot. I distinguish, like a lot of social science, culture from ideology. These are hazy terms, but culture has to do with established ways of doing things, folkways, institutions that preceded and outlasted a particular ideology. And although I've been avoiding talking about Southeast Asia, I do because I just haven't studied it that closely, for one thing. It is evident to me that notwithstanding there are radicals in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, certainly there are, they seem to have less traction in the culture. As I understand it, these jihadist groups are not recruiting as much or having less success. Indonesia is a large country. That's a huge population base potentially, but they don't seem to be getting the traction there that they do in the Middle East, indeed in Western Europe, or even North America. So and what scholarship I know on the Southeast Asia said is culturally it's a different way of doing society. That's very hazy. I apologize for that, but so yeah, and I do want to make clear, I focus on the Middle East because it's the most important, the most on our minds. This is not an attempt to tar the entire region from Western Africa into Southeast Asia as somehow jihadist or potentially jihadist. I think it just depends on time and place. Place, clearly, because Southeast Asia is spawning far less of this, and time also because we are in a particular time when Islamism is parts of it are in a real death cult, but this hasn't been universally true over time. There have been periods where things are much calmer, notwithstanding differences between Muslims and Christians. Things have been much calmer, and so that points us to the possibility of a restoration of something like that. But we are not anywhere near that now in the Middle East. So.
Great. Well, will you please join me in thanking Dr. Owen for this excellent presentation? And thank you all for coming. And as I said, we have books available outside.